Good afternoon, and welcome to the public workshop on advancing pre-market safety analytics. I'm Marianne Hamilton Lopez, Senior Research Director for Biomedical Innovation at the Duke Margolis Center for Health Policy at Duke University. We are convening this workshop under a cooperative agreement with the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. There is a lack of standardization for clinical trial safety data submitted as part of marketing applications. Variability in safety data analysis and visualization has led to inconsistencies and adverse event definition, categorization, analysis, and presentation. This variability can make it more difficult to identify safety signals and conduct follow-on analysis. To improve safety signal detection and evaluation of clinical trial safety data, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration Center for Drug Evaluation and Research's Office of New Drugs led the development of two documents. The first document, the FDA Medical Queries, or FMQs, are a standardized approach to group preferred terms. The second document, the Standard Safety Tables and Figures Integrated Guide, are standardized methods for visualizations of clinical trial safety data into tables and figures. These documents have recently been released for public feedback just last week. This afternoon, we'll get an overview of the two documents, detailing the outlook and process for grouping adverse events in clinical trial safety data and for displaying clinical trial safety data in tables and figures. Now on to the next slide, I'll review the workshop agenda. We'll begin today with opening remarks from CDER's Office of New Drugs. We'll then hear an overview of the FDA medical queries and considerations for including group terms and their component terms in prescription drug labeling, the first of the two presentations by members of the FDA team that developed this document. Next, we'll have a panel discussion on the pre-market adverse event grouping, with stakeholders sharing best practices and emerging technologies to identify and categorize preferred terms. Following a short break, the FDA team will present the Standard Safety Tables and Figures Integrated Guide, covering advanced methods to improve signal detection using algorithmic FMQs that utilize laboratory, medical history, and medication data in addition to the adverse event data that will be introduced. And we'll conclude today's event with a second panel discussion on examining strategies for pre-market adverse event analysis. Before we get started, I'll review our statement of independence. The Margolis Center for Health Policy is part of Duke University, and as such, we honor the tradition of academic independence on behalf of its faculty and its scholars. Neither Duke nor the Margolis Center take partisan positions, but individual members are free to speak their minds and express their opinions on important issues. I'll also add that the conversation today, while supported through a cooperative agreement with FDA, is not a federal advisory committee. We will not be voting, nor will we be making recommendations. Now we have just one more slide with some virtual meeting reminders before we get to opening remarks. All right, attendees are encouraged to contribute to the meeting through the Zoom Q&A function. We at FDA want to hear your feedback and your questions, so please do not hesitate to submit those. Time permitting, we may be able to bring in some audience questions into our panel discussions. And some of our presenters and panelists may also respond via the Q&A function as well. Please keep in mind that the more detailed and technical questions related to the documents are best submitted directly to the docket by October 31st. We'll want to keep the discussion today more high level. We will also be recording this meeting, and we will be posting the recording on the Duke Margolis website for future reference. And before we begin, as a reminder, the scope of today's workshop is focused on the FDA's work to standardize pre-market review of clinical safety data, and also on best practices and innovative approaches to enhance safety analytics in the pre-market setting. Today's workshop is the start of a discussion on a pre-market safety analytics. The release documents represent promising practices for standardization and are not recommendations or guidance documents. We're looking forward to a productive conversation that can help identify opportunities to improve safety, signal detection, and analysis. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Peter Stein, the Director of the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research's Office of New Drugs at FDA, and Dr. Vaishali Patpat, Associate Director for Biomedical Informatics in the Office of New Drugs, to give their opening remarks. Peter, please take it away.
Thank you so much, and really appreciate all the work from your colleagues in helping us to set up this very important session. I want to welcome all of the participants this afternoon. If we can go to the next slide. I'm just going to talk for a few minutes about this really important topic, which has been something that we've been obviously deeply involved and interested in over many, many years. And over the last several years, we've been working on a number of programs that you'll hear more about more in detail. If you go to the next slide, I just wanted to sort of set the stage a little bit and talk a little bit about kind of what we're after, what's the overarching goals of our work in safety analytics. And of course, it relates to, excuse me, our regulatory framework, looking at effectiveness and safety. And safety means we consider it to be safe for use under the conditions prescribed, recommended, or suggested in the labeling. And effectiveness, of course, we talk about substantial evidence of effectiveness based upon adequate and well-controlled investigations. When we think about safety use, we really think about these together, which is really thinking about the benefits outweighing the risks. So even in a product where we've identified substantial risks, if the benefit is critical, for example, in a serious disease with markedly unmet needs and a rapidly progressive course, and the ability of the drug to be properly used under proper monitoring, the benefit risk may well be favorable. Next slide. In thinking about this, it's really part of our framework. I think many of you may be familiar with the benefit risk integrated assessment and framework that we put forward, but this includes risks and risk management and are putting together the evidence as well as the uncertainties and coming to conclusions and ultimately trying to assess both the benefit and the risk and assure that the benefit risk is favorable to move towards an approval of a drug. Next slide, please. So just thinking about the goals of this safety assessment. So what are we working towards with some of the discussions we'll have today? Obviously, our first step is to ensure that the data that's been submitted is adequate and consistent, complete, and that has the appropriate extent and type of exposure. We want to characterize the safety profile, which is always a challenge. We want to identify the adverse drug reactions and other important safety findings so we can determine approvability, be able to have this input into the benefit risk balance, and then determine how best to manage safety issues that are identified. We want to make sure that we can label the drug properly, that we can identify the adverse drug reactions as well as the susceptibility of patients to these safety risks, assure appropriate monitoring and mitigation approaches and management, including whether a REMS is necessary to assure the appropriate benefit risk of the drug. We also want to identify uncertainties. What do we know about the adverse drug reactions? What don't we know? Or what are potential adverse drug reactions? And do we need further characterization beyond routine post-market surveillance, such as PMRs or PMCs or other avenues to develop further evidence about the safety of the drug? Next slide. There are many challenges we're facing with regard to safety assessment that I think are probably quite familiar to those listening in today. Obviously, program and study design issues. Phase 3 studies are powered for efficacy, typically not specifically powered for safety, so we just have to assure there's enough exposure to characterize safety adequately. Each individual study is typically not adequate to assess the overall safety of the drug, more typically, although obviously some larger studies might be. And there's a need for pooling, which has its own challenges. There's a limitation of the patient duration typically in the trials, and so we may not be able to fully understand the long-term safety of the drug. There can be problems with the implementation of the study, such as withdrawal of patients where we don't get adequate follow-up, which can be quite problematic and lead to informative censoring or other problems with incomplete safety information. Obviously, characterizing rare events in databases that might be appropriate for phase 3 programs can be challenging. We want to make sure that patients who are potentially susceptible to the safety concerns are adequately studied so that they can be characterized. And of course, we've had concerns about the diversity of the studied population. Can we characterize it in the overall population, but can we begin to understand what the safety profile looks across a broader range of types of patients and patient populations? In terms of reporting or analytic issues, obviously coding can be an issue. Are we coding the event accurately that really transmits the information about the nature of the event? Are we grouping the terms appropriately to assure that we are not sort of splitting and missing an event because it's been broken into too many different terms? We'll talk a lot about that today. Even when there are medical events that present, they can present in diverse ways and be reported in even more diverse ways, and that can hamper adequate characterization. We often, for non-serious events where it is a relevant event, might not have a lot of detail, and that can be a challenge. And of course, our ability and our tools to look at across the safety parameters, looking at lab associated with clinical data from the adverse event data set, the vital sign data set, can be challenging. And sorting true findings from random imbalances is always an ongoing challenge with looking at safety. Next slide. Today's talks will, I think, particularly focus on the terms I've put in bold in terms of how we group events and how we think about cross data set analysis, and all aimed, of course, to help us to improve our ability to sort true findings from random imbalances. Next slide. So today we're going to discuss some of the projects that my colleagues have been working on now for several years, which are focused on enhancing safety analytics. And we're looking forward to hearing your input, your questions, the panel members' comments on our approaches, and also hearing more about approaches that they've been investigating that can help us to better understand and characterize the safety of drugs, which is, of course, a common effort that we are I'm most interested in, and of course we know many other stakeholders are very interested in as well. I think that the great participation today in this important meeting just reflects how important these issues are. Well, thank you very much, and really looking forward to this exciting meeting, and I'll turn over to Dr. Popat for some comments. Vaishali?
Yeah, thank you, Peter. Next slide, please. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Peter, for your broad overview, direction, and support for the safety analytics initiatives. So I will now focus on pre-market safety working group efforts. In 2017, as part of new drug review modernization effort, the Office of New Drugs formed a working group to evaluate safety review processes. This working group included membership from various therapeutic areas within Office of New Drugs, as well as several offices in Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. The issues that this working group was focusing on was that there was no standardization of processes for NDA BLA safety review, and there was wide variation across division. So the objective of the working group was to perform detailed assessment of the NDA BLA safety review processes and develop an efficient, effective, and standardized process. And we all know that each application has its unique need, but the working group felt that many of the safety analytics could be standardized and also keep the process adaptable to different needs across teams and applications so that it can be modified as well. Next slide, please. So there are several initiatives that were recommended as part of that working group deliverables. I am going to focus on these two. And so there are two important initiatives, the FDA Medical Queries Project and Standard Safety Tables and Figures Project. So we are sharing approaches that we typically take in safety analysis in the spirit of transparency today. You may have seen some of these tables and figures and approaches like FMQ, use of FMQ in our published reviews, because our reviews do become public. And additionally, we have been talking about these initiatives at a high level at various conferences such as Drug Information Association, PU's meeting, CDIS meeting. So today we will provide more details on these approaches, and we are really happy to share that at this link on the slide that you can see here, we have made this detailed documents available for your input and feedback. we really will appreciate your feedback because it just helps us to make these documents better, and continuous improvement is the goal. Now, today, our goal is goal and the hope that today's workshop is just a start of the conversation. So we are launching into this in-depth discussions on pre-market safety analytics. And I hope that in future, we will have some more such meetings.